A very good afternoon to everyone. I think we can get started. For this session, we have Dr. Philipp who will be talking to us about hyperlocality. I hope everyone can hear me, and we welcome the people who are logging on Zoom as well. Over to you, Philipp.
Great, thank you so much. Very warm welcome on an early morning in London and of course late afternoon in Singapore. It's a real pleasure to be with you. I hope you can hear me properly in the room and that we will also be able to conduct this journey through hyperlocality in an interactive way. To do so, it would be great if you already take out your phones or any devices with which you can engage. I have a few polls throughout my presentation. I will also pause here and there. We can open it up. I understand there's a roving mic which will go around and which will facilitate our engagement. So I'll come to my presentation in a moment. It will be in total probably in the region of 45 minutes, but as I said, in blocks. We may want to go over to in total 70 minutes for the seminar, 75 minutes. We'll see how it works. It depends a lot on the degree of debate and questions you have. My name is Philipp Rode. I'm the Executive Director of LSE Cities, a research center here at the London School of Economics dedicated to the study of cities and global urbanization. We have been working collaboratively with many organizations around the world, and Singapore has always been an important anchor for our engagement. We worked with the local universities, government, and of course, the Center for Livable Cities for some time. And it's a real honor to be part of this workshop series, and I hope this will be of interest. Good, so let me begin. To kick us off, I mean, here just a reminder what I will be talking about. I hope the slide sharing is coming through. Is that correct? Can you see this now? I'm assuming it's all fine. At the moment, I don't get direct sound. So if you can also react as David just did, thumbs up, that will be always helpful. So hyperlocality in planning, this is a terminology which has recently emerged, of course, to a large degree due to COVID-19 and the enforced hyperlocality in many of our cities. But it ultimately led to a really important question about balancing micro and macro accessibility in our cities. And I want to unpack all of these terms over the next hour in greater detail. But there's, of course, one very fundamental concept that's underpinning this debate, and that is the 15-minute city, which in so many different contexts by now has become a paradigm for planning. It has also stirred up some controversies, both within professional communities, but more importantly, within policy and politics. I can allude to that. The original traction was really produced by the city of Paris. That's why you see some of the references here in French, not sort of being the first city embracing sort of a temporal reference to proximity, but being the first city that really quite centrally dedicated a whole election campaign by the mayor Anne Hidalgo in 2000 around this notion, and backed up by Carlos Moreno, a professor at the local university, really giving it the intellectual underbelly. So to get us started, I thought it would be worth to get a sense from you. What is it you associate with a 15-minute city? So you can scan this with your phones. In a moment, I also give you a code. It should lead to a Mentimeter survey, which I'm sure you're familiar with. I want to just get a sense, what do you associate with the 15-minute cities? 3 key words that come to mind. That can be positive associations, negative. It's entirely up to you. Let's just collect this a bit. So I hope you were able to copy this code here. I will now go to the Mentimeter presentation. Give me a second. And there you will also have the code again. Okay, and this is where we want to also see what's coming up here. And I'm seeing already some of you becoming active. Many thanks. Here again, if you have difficulty scanning, you can use the code, go to menti.com, and then it's 22580084. And I say this again, 22580084. All right, it's still building up. So what do we have here? Get a nice number of responses. So across the board, I'm just scanning here whether there's anything which we would consider as a negative association, and that so far doesn't seem to be the case. The very big ones here, walkable, walking, the two combined would probably be the most important one. And we have dense, accessible, cycling, vibrant, and then a lot of singular mentions ranging from car light to relationships, comfortable, people. Here's a negative, impractical, very important. We'll have to get back to that. There's a contrast of awesome, multifunctional, so you can see here for yourself. Thank you very much for engaging with this right up front. And I will now go back to my presentation to give you in some ways a bit sort of my more formal way of conceptualizing initially the idea of the 15-minute city and then going into the practical elements. So over the next remaining time for the lecture, we'll first get a bit into this quite fundamental question of, can cities be hyperlocal? Can it be squared, the hyperlocality, with our aspiration for big labor markets and metropolitan regions? Second, we'll step back from this and look at a much broader notion of urban accessibility, also historically, which is quite helpful to unpack. The term accessibility was already mentioned. And then we come to two main concepts that's behind questions of both accessibility and also hyper localization. On the one hand, the more traditional planning framing around the compact city, or here referred to as compact, connected, and clean. And then this more specific, more recent embracing of chrono-urbanism, the reference to time, and then, of course, the 15-minute city concept. Let me begin here with our first overview. And there, of course, is the question. And what I thought would be very helpful to begin with is this question of what is it that binds cities together? What you can see here is the vast metropolitan region of Tokyo, with the population densities. The higher these, they happen to be square kilometers, the higher these bars, the higher the density. And then in red, you have the definition of the political city. So this is what the Tokyo government, the core government, oversees. Of course, there are other municipalities and other layers of government. But stepping back from all of this, if you're an economist, you will be familiar with this idea of the functional urban region, questions about integrated labor markets, where you do so appreciate that there are a lot of closer relationships, physical, but then also network relationships across the territory. And that may help us to define what is the city ultimately. If you are an urban planner, you may take particular interest in space and may even look at aerial photography and try to understand where is the built up territory, where are the key infrastructures, and in that sense, you could develop an understanding where is the real boundary of the city, what is holding it together. And if you're a geographer, you may want to take a whole range of different indicators, from the population densities to the relationships within the territory, labor market dynamics, and of course also the physical nature of the city. And that brings us to maybe one quite standard way of thinking about defining the city, which is the commuter belt or the commuter shed. And the argument here is that we want to define the city and metropolitan region in relation to the people that have daily access to probably the core city, but certainly where there's a high level of exchange. So what you do in this instance, you take a metropolitan region and you analyze in which towns and villages further afield do you still have a certain threshold of number of people commuting or engaging on a daily basis with the core city. And you can then get sort of wonderful differences in terms of cities depending on the speed of travel. Now, if you go back in history and you said everyone needs to walk, no horse-drawn carriages, it will be difficult to engage with something that is longer in terms of distance than 2 kilometers, taking into account something which we know from anthropology, that typically and historically there's a relatively constant travel time budget of about an hour per day. So that results in your 2-kilometer radius for the pedestrian city. But if you consider high-speed rail, you could probably in an hour return journeys live at a distance of 100 kilometers. And that's pretty much what we're seeing here for London's metropolitan commuter flows. Although if you go to the 100 kilometer distance, these are often 2-hour commutes, which may not be desirable and far exceed our travel time budget. So these are some ideas of how we can formulate the city. But then we come to two really interesting dynamics. Before getting to them, what is fascinating is if we take this inclusive approach of defining the city, as I've just done, we can probably really cover all of the roughly 10,000 cities across the globe with that definition. We could identify them and establish the boundaries for them. So it's fairly consistent with the ground realities and then also with the statistical exercises that exist. But now coming to the disruption, because we have seen for some decades that there are also network cities evolving. What you see here is a map of Germany, my home country, where there are, in some instances, even commuter flows across or between cities, where people travel daily between Hamburg and Berlin, for example, or between Stuttgart and Frankfurt. They do that in most instances by high-speed rail. Increasingly, with modern jobs, they may also do this less frequently, so not daily, but maybe weekly or twice a month. But it's still part of, let's call it sort of the knowledge economy labor market shed. So the original logic of the daily frequency starts dissolving. And then we come to the right side of hyper-localization, which clearly we have seen, particularly following lockdown and the various COVID initiatives, but also then as a result of new work, where we see more frequent and then closer trips within our local neighborhoods, maybe to our neighborhood offices and the local opportunities. Now, these are two dynamics which make the original question of what holds a city or binds it together increasingly difficult. So I'm not offering a solution here. I'm just saying we need to be aware of this. Now, you're in Singapore, where the definition of the city overlaps with the definition of a nation state. And in some ways, you're well protected with that definition, because if you go beyond it, it involves crossing a national boundary or border with all sorts of border controls. So you don't have, in that sense, an open labor market for the broader regional context in that case. Now, I mentioned already COVID, and COVID allowed us to reappreciate the tendencies of localization and become more aware of trip shares in relation to what is actually happening on a daily level in our cities. And one way of visualizing this is this triangle, which always combines the different share of trip lengths that are on the one hand below 2 kilometers. So this is the 15-minute walking. So they go on the bottom from the left to right, from 0 on the right side to 100% on the very left. On the green arrow here, going from the top to then the bottom right, is the city level mobility share. So these are trips between 2 to 10 kilometers, typically within 15 to 45 minutes. This may be the majority of trips you're familiar to in the case of Singapore. And then in blue, from the bottom left to the top, we have the regional level mobility. This is the trip share of trips above 10 kilometers. And that's a relatively new way of thinking then to understand where do different cities or metropolitan regions sit. The 15-minute city, very much here at the bottom left. Then the 1 hour metropolis, a term I'll come back to later on, here at the bottom to the right. And then something which we may want to refer to as exurbia, where you have an enormous amount of mobility needs and time requirements because people are so hyper mobile. Now, using that visualization and getting into the context of COVID, here we see what happened to London, which originally, and this is data from Teralytics that looks at mobile phone use, and we can track very local trips in a high level of accuracy. And we can see how London had, and these are always the trip shares from the very local then to the hypermobility ones. Was sort of well situated between where you would say it is a city which is a 1 hour metropolis on average. And then came the lockdown, which completely propelled by force the city into hyperlocalization, right? And then we are sort of slowly now going back, and in some ways we are on a trajectory back to the original pattern, but no one expects that we will end up exactly with this pattern. And arguably London will remain more hyper-localized than ever before. But this is a speculation which will be interesting to observe in the future. So far we talk about trends and patterns and measurements, but now comes a normative question about should cities be hyperlocal? And on the one hand, I think we could all agree that a higher share of voluntary local trips without access constriction in terms of travel time, costs, and other mobility services is actually quite desirable. It's great if you have access to your daily needs close by. We would also, I think, all agree that constraints on accessing the wider city and having to stay local with limited local opportunities is socially and economically problematic. So that's important for hyper localization. Now, moving to the right, I think there's also by now a considerable degree of understanding that hypermobility, where we're increasing the share of longer regional trips, is no longer as desirable as it may have been even a few decades ago. We know that there are considerable personal costs as commuting, as research into long commuting has shown, from stress to literally financial costs to frustration, mental health. I mean, there are all sorts of things, not seeing your family, less focused at work. There's the compromise of sort of environmental sustainability, higher energy demand, higher carbon emissions. We know that by now. And we're also compromising what we ultimately want from cities, which is a coherent place function where public space really serves the purpose of meeting rather than the provision of excessive movement. Good. So now, if you then go back to trends and you try to unpack what is actually happening empirically, we are at an interesting juncture. And clearly there are a whole range of factors which could explain that we may be tipping into hyperlocalization. Economic factors, technological innovation, probably the most important one. Think of hybrid work and living. There's demographic change, external shocks, we have seen those. Urban change itself, a new appreciation for urban living. Car ownership, I mean, considering that the car is such an important thing and the attitudes of car ownership changing, certainly in OECD country contexts. And then there's policy intention, which responds in particular to social and environmental sustainability. Now, what is the city then if we embrace the notion of sort of hyper locality? What is bringing it all together? And I once referred to, maybe we can frame the city as a calm lake with a shared temperature. The shared temperature is essentially a sense of commonality. There is, of course, an exchange needed, but not everyone. It's a political space. It's a cultural space. It's something about belonging, rather than sort of a whirlpool where all elements are in constant motions and where every resident within a week cycle sort of is almost visiting most parts of that city, which of course never really happens. So that's a way of maybe reframing this idea of what binds cities together, and at the same time appreciating that sort of hyperlocality may have something to offer. Good. Let me now come to urban accessibility. But before I do so, I want to just pause for a moment and see whether there are any questions. And I hope my colleagues will be able to deal with the microphone, or people who are online, please do just come in. Any questions so far in relation to this framing? No? Good. So I take that for granted. All is clear. Let's then really
Philipp,
move
I think
on.
we have one question.
Yes, please.
Professor, I noticed you have just now shown us a map of London with the radius all the way up to 100 kilometers. Is this traveling for work, or is it just for recreation? And what is the surrounding population of this area you have covered in your plan?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you for that question. It is the commuter belt. So it's the daily commutes at that time. So this was pre-COVID. And if you take that, let's call it the geographers and maybe the economist definition of the functional urban region, instead of 9 million people, that's the political London, London would have a population of about 20 to 21 million, because you are incorporating these territories with a high level of engagement with London. And for comparative purposes, this is actually quite important. If you compare metropolitan regions in the world, you do want to go to the metro level. Take Paris. Paris is even more extreme, where the political Paris is only 2 million people. That's the very core of the city. It's the tourist Paris within the periphery. But the metropolitan region is much more similar to that of even New York, London, Tokyo, and in the Paris case again, around 20 million. Any further questions? Okay, so let me move on, because the concept we really need to appreciate now is urban accessibility. And here I want to begin with a quote by Ed Glaeser, the Harvard economist, who once said, "Cities exist to eliminate transport costs for people, goods, and ideas." So at the heart of this is a proposition that cities are almost transport solutions. They allow us to engage with each other on a fairly regular basis with reduced time costs, but also financial costs, costs in terms of opportunities, convenient, and you can extend this massively, but broadly speaking, all sorts of costs. And historically, this has been achieved in many different ways, but what has always been a driving component of that achievement are transport technologies. So what you're seeing here is a depiction of the Victorian London of the 19th century, with the famous terrace houses, which were rolled out for the workers at the time. And this typology, this urban form, would have been impossible without the transport technology in the backdrop, in the background here, the steam engine. This was the first time that we could really expand urban territories into the broader metropolitan region and not get to 100 kilometers, but let's get at least to 20 kilometers in terms of distance to where maybe your work would take place. Now let's move to another very important transformation in terms of technologies. This is the turn of the last century, so the early 1900s, where we had the electrification of all our systems, including transport. This is a photograph of Broadway in New York City, one of the cities alongside Berlin that were really embracing this idea of electrification. In this case, of course, with the electric streetcar, cleaning up the mess of horse-drawn carriages and really allowing a hyper-intense coming together of people. You can see the level of engagement of many high levels of population concentrations. It was at that time that also the elevator was invented, another electric form of transport, enabling the verticalization of our buildings, and once again really adding to the current notion of what a city is all about. High degrees of density and engagement and interaction. But then you come to a post-war innovation in transport, the motor car, and it did something to cities which is fundamentally different. This is a famous intersection of a motorway in Los Angeles, arguably one of the cities that first embraced the car as its universal tool for access. And in some ways, the car and its infrastructures dissolved the city. It created metropolitan regions and sprawl and agglomeration, but maybe to some degree in the absence of what we would consider core qualities of the city, public space, coming together. And if you now superimpose this highway intersection on a lot of European inner city areas, and even if you take some of the very beloved central areas of Singapore, you will see that this piece of infrastructure, as marvelous as it is probably bigger than many of the core areas of interaction of many of our cities worldwide. So we're starting to see an inherent contradiction where we are embracing new transport technologies, hypermobility, and yet at the same time wanting to create cities or cityness. And if we come to today, where we have in many of our cities almost overlapping forces, often in the same place. On the one hand, this further embracing of road building, car mobility, resulting in the endless city. This is the urban periphery of Mexico. And on the other hand, the hyperdensities of places like Hong Kong. Of course, also a lot of these densities you will find in Singapore, where you have far greater levels of accessibility, but a very different way of living, not in your individual house and not your own garden, but with a lot of facilities, maybe at the ground floor and within your neighborhood. And if you wanted to have sort of a rough idea of how impactful these different propositions are in terms of access by motion and access by compaction and different means of travel, look at this comparison of Atlanta and Berlin, two cities, fairly similar wealth level, fairly similar population size. And then what we're seeing here is the built up land at scale. So this is exactly the same geographic scale in black for the two cities, and superimposed in red, the rapid rail system. And as a result of that difference, in Atlanta, you have less than 10% that can walk, cycle, or take public transport. And in Berlin, this is by now actually well above 70%. So this kind of stuff really matters a lot. And therefore, as a main takeaway, if we're now thinking about urban accessibility beyond transport, we need to acknowledge that it's the coming together of at least three different factors. Yes, transport and ICT policy is fundamental. We need that for the connectivity function, but we need urban planning, and we need to think about where the locations and the opportunities are located in space to make actually sense of building accessibility. And then you have a third component around social policy that considers the costs of travel, but also the costs of living and working. How expensive is it in different parts of the city, and ideally, how affordable is it? Good. I want to now continue with our poll. So if you go back to the same link, and what we want to do here is hear from you. Where do you see synergies, but also conflicts between the 15-minute city ideal and something that is, you could call the 1-hour metropolis, where you try to achieve great connectivity at the level of the metropolitan region. So I'll now go back to our overview, and let me see whether I can advance the slide. Yes, so this should be now available for you to comment on these different qualities and the extent to which you consider them in conflict or as in synergy. At the moment, I don't see anything coming up, but let me wait a bit longer. Do shout if you have problems accessing this file, if that's not yet unlocked. I see everyone working, so I'm assuming it's fine. Let's just give this a bit more time. Think about how, okay, perfect. Here we have the first responses coming up. I won't comment yet. Let's just see what the group thinks. Clear pattern emerging so far with the role of the private car as being in full conflict. The type of urban street use sort of is average, cosmopolitan characters average, the spatial distribution same. Great, so we're at 12 participants here. You see the results yourself. Would anyone like to comment? Is there anything surprising before I offer my perspective? So do come in with the microphone if you want to comment. I think that's not the case. We clearly, I think, are all in agreement with the role of the private car. That seems to be a major conflict, but also do keep in mind that the private car may not be that ideal even for the 1 hour metropolis, because you, of course, have then clear limitations in terms of the number of people you move into a metropolis where there is still a proper urban core. So both the 1 hour metropolis with transport efficiencies accessing higher dense areas will require considerable amount of public transport, and that's of course not in contradiction with the 15-minute city. I mean, level of mixed use is fairly synergetic. You could argue same density, that should be an advantage for both a more effective and efficient metropolitan region and 15-minute city. The type of urban street use, I think we could argue that there are, I mean, the car really is problematic for both, as I just said. But you could argue that, for example, BRT, bus rapid transit, trams, so relatively high-speed vehicles, public transport vehicles at surface level in our streets is advantageous for the 1 hour metropolis, maybe more difficult for the 15-minute city. Metropolitan rail could be entirely synergetic, particularly if it's underground or above ground. We talked about the car, walking and cycling. I mean, keep in mind that the 1 hour metropolis, because it is so dependent on public transport, in the end needs to produce good walkability or even good cyclability at some point in these nodes of transport. The spatial distribution of offices, that's an interesting one. You could, of course, argue that the high centralization of offices is something that the 1 hour metropolis can work well with, creating these rapid rail corridors into the core city, and the more distributed approach of the 15-minute city could be something different. And the cosmopolitan character of cities, well, I guess critics of the 15-minute city would argue that if you don't have neighborhoods that are particular, that have extreme concentrations, you may lose some of this. Think of your downtown, think of Manhattan, think of central London, inner Paris. To some degree, there is a sort of cosmopolitan character that depends on many people coming in that may not have those qualities within their neighborhoods further afield. Thank you very much. Again, do always come in if you have comments, particularly for these more interactive elements. But I will now go back to the presentation as I don't see anyone wanting to speak. And I will now come to, in some ways, a reminder of this paradigm around the compact city, which has been around since the early 1990s. And it's important to remind ourselves what this is all about, because in so many ways, the 15-minute city argument is, and hyper-localization builds on this. So the fundamental proposition here is that more compact, connected, and clean growth built around mass public transport can create cities that are economically more dynamic. They're also healthier and have lower emissions. So you, in some ways, get closest to this win-win of economic and social sustainability as well as environmental sustainability. That's not to say that there are problems about embedded carbon and all sorts of issues, but at the same wealth level, people living in more compact contexts, you create far greater environmental efficiencies. And you probably all know where these come from. In the transport case, you have reduced distances and greater shares of green modes. You have greater heat energy efficiencies in buildings. You can roll out grid-based systems, low embedded energy demand for infrastructure, but also operational systems. And then some argue that even there is an opportunity for more sustainable lifestyles. Think in particular about the sharing economy, car sharing, sharing all sorts of goods and services, which really improves the environmental equation. There's a counter argument to the last, which is that cities are also about hyper-consumption. And if you think of the locales of fast fashion and mega shopping, and shopping as almost a form of entertainment and a hobby, that tends to be more of an urban rather than a non-urban sort of phenomenon. There are many related concepts. Compact city is just one reference. In the US in the 90s, the term smart growth, not related to technology at the time, has been quite popular. Transit-oriented development, decentralized concentration, the city of short distances, as well as, of course, the 15-minute city, to which we come in a moment. The key ideas here, again, this should be fairly familiar, is a spatial planning approach that considers higher densities, mixed use and urban design quality, and on the transport side, prioritization of public transport, walking and cycling, while mitigating the adverse effect of vehicular traffic. So the pattern of road design becomes quite fundamental. The more there is permeability, this is sort of the urban designer's speech, the better, rather than sort of the cul-de-sac trapping yourself into some complicated grids, what you see here in Sacramento, more difficult, or in Irvine with the super block where there's very little opportunity to in some ways walk the territory. What you see in Rome, San Francisco, Portland comes much closer to that ideal. You would want to then have a very clear hierarchy of physical distances, consider what kind of opportunities can be brought more local or in the neighborhood, but also we need to appreciate that certain urban functions will always remain at the city level. And this is a bit where maybe the 15-minute city is more ambitious. It really tries to put the emphasis on the local and the neighborhood. And that also raises the question, what's the economic logic behind having more dispersed opportunities? And of course, the sort of tendency for bigger shops, bigger hospitals, which are then more further afield, there's an economic rationale of offering these services and goods cheaper. So we have to be aware of that tendency. But it can also be argued that a lot of this concentration that has happened, the big mega stores, was essentially externalizing costs to then the end consumers who had to travel much further and were also affected by a loss of quality access, enjoying the access to those retail and service opportunities. So that's an important consideration here. Now, the outcomes of the compact city and sort of political advocacy, you'll find a lot of sort of positive narratives. I have listed them all here on the left. As academics, if we look at it through actual data, we get very strong positive correlations with economic productivity, with innovation, the value of space, and of course, access to services. And we also detect potential trade-offs if not designed well, with biodiversity, if not provided with alternatives to vehicular traffic. We have congestion, and there are mental health and heat island effects. Again, if you don't consider nature and to the degree to which you can mitigate the complexities of having many people within the same territory. When we come to implementation, it's important to acknowledge that the compact city really is in some ways applied across a spectrum of interventions, smaller scale retrofitting and urban regeneration under the broader umbrella of urban redevelopment. So working within the footprint of the city, but equally we have urban expansion with greenfield development following the fundamental logic of density, mixed use, public transport access, and so on. So here are a few examples from recent policy and projects that have really taken on this paradigm. The London plan has been quite influential in the London case, and you can see that actual development quite soon after the London plan was published and the advocacy already happened, that new floor space delivery, both for office, retail, and to some degree even residential space, followed public transport, was more centrally located initially, so building the city from the inward out rather than the other way around, and really led to a considerable degree of redensification. Since 2011, this has become even more extreme, and London is producing densities which were unimaginable at the time. Here an example from Copenhagen, Ørestad, where the idea of the compact city is in some ways extended to the interface with nature, so build up at high degree of urbanization all the way to the border of the city. Nothing new to you in Singapore, you have been doing that for some time. In Europe, under normal circumstances, you would have cutesy little detached housing with very few people living, so this is quite a different approach. An example closer to your part of the world, in central Guangzhou, this relates to mixed use, a formerly completely, you could almost say, sterile housing complex, a social housing area which was retrofitted with a ground floor with all sorts of different uses, services, shopping, retail, arts, and cafes. And since then, this social housing estate area, relatively centrally located, has become even an attraction for tourists to go to, because it has also been exposed to new opportunities in the public space, and really a wonderful example of conversion. In terms of the connectivity function, a very important story of the compact city is introducing bus rapid transit to existing urban motorways, which may be the legacy of past planning and hard to just undo, but then instead using them for private cars, you use them for very efficient public transport. Just compare the number of people that are being moved here on the right side on the 3 lanes of traffic, about 3,000 per hour per direction, with the 2 lanes of the bus rapid transit, which is about 40,000 in the context of Bogota. And you get a sense of the opportunity to then build up the city, increase density and opportunities once the bus system is in place. And then a more recent technological opportunity that speaks to using road space more efficiently, digital van service. So in some ways, it's the Uber model, but shared, so ride sharing at scale, maybe up to 12, 15 passengers, and being picked up at the street corner instead of your front door. It seems to be a very interesting complementary approach. And if it's then done with new vehicles, electric, you also connect the connected and the clean component of the compact city. Good. So with that, let's now come to chrono-urbanism and how the 15-minute city features as part of these practices. And I want to contrast initially, in some ways, the endless agglomeration. This happens to be, again, Atlanta, the street grid, where the consideration for actual travel distances in kilometers was a secondary thought. And unfortunately, as a secondary effect, the amount of time spent traveling is also not centrally positioned. There wasn't an aspiration to say, oh, we want to ensure that everyone is connected within an hour. There was an aspiration to have housing, to build motorways, to allow for the freedom of car use. So I'm sort of a bit polemical, sort of referring here to the endless agglomeration. That's quite different to then an attempt of bringing in the efficiency of public transport with the 1 hour metropolis. I'm using here an extreme photo of overcrowding within public transport, because in some ways that's the unique opportunity which public transport provides us with. Being able across a wider territory of pumping hundreds of thousands, even millions of people into rather confined territories at relative great speeds. So that's a bit the approach of a great deal of mobility, but publicly delivered and sort of publicly experienced. And then we have the 15-minute city with the attempt to provide as many opportunities as possible close by within a 15-minute cycling or walking distance. Now that difference is actually quite important, because if you take 15-minute cycling and just think about how many kilometers you could possibly do, whether that's 5 or even 8 or 10, you fairly quickly get to relatively large areas which could even accommodate 200, maybe even 300,000 people within the so-called 15-minute city by bike. In most conversations, it's closer to 15-minute city walking. So we are back to the 2 kilometers squared. And then at sort of reasonable densities, we're talking about 10, 20, 30,000 people maybe living within that area. And here a quote by Carlos Moreno, who has sort of theorized some of that thinking. For him, the quality of urban life is inversely proportional to the amount of time invested in transportation, more so through the use of automobiles. So you get a direct sense what it is one is trying to overcome. 2 things: travel time, and second, certainly the use of automobiles. Similar to the compact city, there are lots of different concepts and association around the 15-minute city. Chrono-urbanism, just referring, of course, to centrally considering time and communicating it to the general public. Super blocks, low traffic neighborhoods, tactical urbanism, parklets, new working spaces, co-working spaces, walkable city. You have, of course, also here a considerable overlap with some of the compact city ideas, but now focusing in. There are a couple of key components following again Moreno. Increased proximity between key urban functions. They identify the sort of translated from French, the 6 of living, working, commerce, healthcare, education, and entertainment. Entertainment probably should be leisure more broadly. Increased social interaction. Digitalization is sort of fully incorporated as a driver, and then diversity. This is not just diversity of functions, but diversity of the population. And here the most obvious critiques, and we of course saw already that some of you were a bit more reserved about it. There may be a tension with the ultimate metropolitan logics. You see here the employment density of London on the right side. So the metropolitan logic that these territories aren't sort of evened out, and that you want to have spikes within the metropolitan territory of hyperintensity around universities or the opera or an area where people go out and restaurants. And so that there is a bit of a question. There's another critique that that's a sort of paradigm best suited for European cities. I would probably include here even places like, of course, Hong Kong and Singapore, but less so for the global South and North American context. A very sort of severe concern is that it promotes gentrification and maybe exclusion, also leads to social segregation. And that has been a lot of the pushback from American scholars saying like, look, we would be worried, and given the legacies and histories of US American cities, I think that is an important worry, that then the individual sort of 15-minute cities turn inwards, and you have isolated neighborhoods and a city of new walls. So that indeed is a concern. If we then, instead of just the 15-minute city, come back to something which is a bit more open, hyperlocalization, I think we can argue that overall, leveraging the potential of local loops and proximity while mitigating the downsides of spatial segregation and inequality must be a good thing. And rebuilding cities around then 15-minute neighborhoods, which may not even be clearly defined as such. It's more the argument that wherever you live in the broader metropolitan area, you do have within 15-minute cities from your front door access to these basic services, rather than relying on excessive mobility. The broad policy priorities then also become clear: inclusive zoning, affordable infill housing, mixed-use development, flexible use of buildings. We need new metrics for urban development, replacing sort of traditional predict and provide transport metrics, really trying to understand how do we appreciate accessibility as the ultimate public good, and how are we then producing that in the best possible way. I want to now finish with a few examples of what is happening in cities around the world, and then I hope we can open it up for conversation and exchange. The first is, of course, Paris itself. I mentioned that in some ways Paris led the most recent excitement, but also the controversy around the 15-minute city. And in their sort of internal publication, there's a lot about the use of streets, neighborhood streets, away from the movement function to the place function, a place for kids, for trees, for greenery, for new urban opportunities, while shifting mobility towards what is more, you could say, urban agreeable. And you know, this kind of transformation, if you have lived with vehicles in urban streets for some time, even though in those inner city areas it's typically only 20 to 30% that can physically drive, creates a lot of disruption politically, and there are interesting tensions. So in Paris, they are sort of playing out fairly well. The mayor, I think, is on course, but in other areas in the world, those interventions have been received by a lot of political opposition. Another example are the super blocks in Barcelona, which has this sort of traditional, very beautiful Seda grid-based pattern, which is being transformed with a range of key initiatives. Here you have a map of how the city communicates these different super blocks. So this is the entire city on the right here of Barcelona. And then you have significant transformation, that's anything in pink, of the public spaces, in green, improvements of neighborhoods and venues, the reactivation of economic fabric, the fostering of sustainable mobility, a lot about public transport and shared mobility, and then also increasing public housing stock. So that you can see sort of the social agenda mixing in. Let's come to a very different context here in London, in outer London, so in much more suburban context where it's more difficult to deal with 15-minute neighborhoods. That's the term they are using. So in the London borough of Newham, the three key components are here about places for community and enterprise, the shared spaces, particularly around the local high street, and then a connected neighborhood. These are the key strategies. I won't go through all the details here, but you have access to this, so you get a sense of the different interventions which sit underneath those three components. Now, I said that this may sound like a European project. It's not. There are many cities internationally that even before Paris have been talking about this. Here an example of sort of urbanizing a rural village by Yun Lake in China, where on the left you recognize sort of the traditional pattern of many of these urban villages in China, where then with sort of a new attempt of creating decentralized concentration, you have all sorts of different functions being fairly well distributed. So in a very different context, this is also being thought about, the temporal dimension. You even have plays with, should it be 15-minute or 1 minute or 30 minutes? In Stockholm, there's literally the idea of the 1-minute neighborhood where it's a strong reference to living on top of your shop and having access to immediate access to many opportunities at the ground floor of your building. And in the case of Bogota, a bit more sort of careful with, what time commitment are we making? Here, 30 minutes seems more appropriate because the city traditionally relied on an enormous amount of commutes and access from poorer peripheral neighborhoods like the one I'm showing you here into the core city. But now there is an agenda to increasingly bring in opportunities for work, education, health in those locales and aiming for sort of these 30 minutes as part of it. Now, three defining trends moving forward, and this is now beyond the practices. The first will be how global urbanization will continue embracing land take or not. This is a photo of Abu Dhabi with an excessive amount of land take and urban sprawl. These are individual villas built around urban motorways. It's in many ways the opposite of the 15-minute city. But at the moment, globally, we are still in a period of excessive urban expansion, maybe expanding twice as fast territorially than we do in terms of population. So that leads to a lot of de-densification. If that is not changing, the 15-minute city agenda will be very hard to achieve at scale. The second fundamental technological innovation around physical movement is the idea of autonomous driving, where in some ways you could argue public transport extends into individual units, or traditional car mobility is sort of upgraded where you no longer have to drive. This is sort of a vision by Mercedes-Benz, how they would think about that future. But keep in mind that it's very hard at scale to combine this kind of mobility in a hyper dense urban area. So the question really becomes, where is the person traveling to? If everyone arrives with these kind of vehicles, you have a considerable problem. So there we need to be careful that the type of autonomous vehicles which will eventually be introduced to our cities in 10, 15 years are really dealt with in such a way that it's more urban agreeable, and policy will have to follow suit. But maybe the most fundamental technological story that will impact on everything I've said is the future of virtualization and the issue of hybridity, where we combine physical access with virtual access, and where this kind of new thing needs to be negotiated in, at the moment, very unclear ways. We don't have a good sense once also we have opportunities for augmented reality, how this is all going to play out. It's all to say that this kind of opportunity will have a huge impact on how we roll out a more time-conscious, physical access-oriented city and neighborhoods in the future. So I want to end now with, again, another poll looking at what you think are the most important factors of hyperlocalization in your city. So I'm assuming that will be mostly about Singapore, and then we can open it up for discussion. So let me activate the final poll. Give me a second here, and then this will hopefully lead into an interesting final exchange. Good. So here we have 8 different factors. I included another one just in case you think I'm missing out on something important. If that's the case, we of course want to hear about it. I'll give you a bit of time to go over that. Good. We're reaching again the end of that poll. Clear front runner here is more opportunities for walking and cycling. Greater levels of mixed use coming up. Then economic incentives for small scale retail and services. And then sort of a bit reduced the temporal use story, new working and co-working space, mobile service provision, greater population densities, I guess they already exist. And then we have other. Let's begin with other, and maybe we can hear from those that indicated other, what they were referring to.
Hi, good afternoon. With other, I meant actually to refer to the car lane width and the space used for cars.
Okay.
In Singapore, there's quite a lot of space used for cars and also parking.
Perfect. I mean, you would probably also appreciate that there's an overlap with more opportunities for walking and cycling, but I think you make an important point about more directly having policy that reduces the space take, the excessive space take for privately owned cars. I think it's a very important addition. Okay, and there's another one which I think had considered other. Do we have someone else?
Hello. Hi. Can you hear me? Hello.
Can you speak closer to the microphone so I can hear you properly? Thank you.
Hi, Dr. Philipp. Can you hear me?
Now it's perfect. Thank you.
Yes. I actually place the other considering the connectivity to outside of this hyper localized city. That means the connectivity to external. Yeah.
External, like say more about connectivity to what, or what is sort of think about like a planner or policymaker, what would you actually do? Give an example.
For instance, if I'm living in a hyper-localized city, if my accessibility to external cities is so poor, I will remain within the hyper-localized city. However, if I'm well connected to external cities, I may travel out more outside of this hyper-localized city.
Oh, that's a really important contribution, and it's again, it's a polemic, because you're absolutely right that hyperlocalization, of course, could be achieved quite easily by making mobility much more difficult and have less opportunities to be connected at the metropolitan level. So let's take an example. If you live in an area where you have high frequent rail travel every 10 minutes to a very attractive shopping area, if you were to reduce that to a frequency of 1 hour, for sure local shops will come up. So you have a really, that's a really important point. All right, let me end this here, and we have a few more minutes. If you have any questions, please do come in. Happy to clarify this a bit more, and colleagues locally will deal with the roving mic.
Hi, Dr. Philipp.
Yes. Yeah.
Actually, I'm very curious because you shared many examples of hyper-localized cities in the world. I just want to get to understand from your view, to date, which cities you feel is one of the most successful hyper-localized city. And because from my perspective, we're doing more on transport planning per se. So we just want to get some sensing whether, because our sensing is hyper-localized cities generally are very, I would say the population we're looking is quite dense. And in terms of transport-wise, I think we focus a lot on walking and cycling within the 15 minutes or 1 minute or 10 minute or 20 minute city. But we often, I feel that we often focus too much on within the cities, but what about outside of these cities? Yeah. This is one of my concerns.
So okay, my first response is clearly those cities that have historically been embracing the compaction, mixed use, public transport, must be the ones that are most advanced. And there are, many of the places I mentioned, certainly Barcelona, Paris, parts of London, although London is already a bit different. The cities I would add in Europe are certainly also Vienna in Austria, really important contribution in that regard. And in Southern Europe, we're seeing a lot of interesting practices coming out of Milan, although traditionally that has also been a city which has been embracing car mobility and sort of a much greater degree of hyper mobility. And then there are a few smaller sized cities that for some time had a very strong green agenda. And here I would mention Bilbao in Spain, Freiburg in Germany, and probably also Copenhagen. Now, stepping back from these European examples, if you look at Latin America, there are certainly medium-sized second-tier cities in Colombia that are of interest. Medellin, possibly most relevant because they invested a lot of new infrastructures, transport infrastructures, alongside service provisions within local, often lower income communities. So that's a really important reference point. Quito in Ecuador, another city I would highlight. And if we then come to Asia, the first thing to say is that traditionally you have a much greater sort of appreciation of physical proximity in Asia, certainly compared to the Americas. So the traditional Indian city, Chinese city, Japanese city has sort of, in some ways, the logic much more built in terms of where policy is really now that replicating it at the moment I mean, it has taken off to a degree in China, but by comparison to India, which has organically produced so much 15-minute stuff, India is probably still far ahead. Also because there are more constraints, it's poorer, people walk and cycle more. You know, if I wasn't talking to you in Singapore, I would say your own city is, of course, an interesting area for experimentation. Although, and with colleagues, we have discussed this a lot, the earlier comment about, yes, Singapore, sustainable city, compact city, public transport oriented. What is a huge frustration is indeed the urban design in your residential as well as inner city area feels very car oriented.
Yeah.
If you want to go running in Singapore or walk for a longer period, the amount of crossings that are difficult with relatively fast moving vehicles is still quite, I would say, problematic, but there's an opportunity to do something about it.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Do you have any maybe you can share more about what do you think is the balance within a hyper localized city? Because like I mentioned earlier, I think a lot of the concept is I would say densify an area with people with multi land use, etc. Is there a way that we can balance it? Maybe you can share your view on it.
So the first approach I would engage with here is a balance between the frequency of metropolitan-wide trips as opposed to local trips. And I think for people that are not in full employment, so the elderly, children, I would have thought that for all local trips to your local shop, school, health center, I would argue a ratio of something like 5:1 or even 10:1 feels quite appropriate. It's different for people who are in full employment. I think we need to accept that there is a higher frequency of engaging with the wider city. But even here, a ratio of 1:2 or 1:3 is quite desirable in favor for local trips, as opposed to metropolitan-wide trips. So that's one way of answering it. But I think you then have to translate this to the balance of the type of mobility you are providing for, the street space you're associating with different functions. I think the most important thing is that we are dramatically reconsidering, while also appreciating the political dynamics, the role of the private car and the degree to which that is something we are willing to continue. And second, the issue of parking, because so much parking, particularly surface parking, reduces then opportunities for greater accessibility locally. Because you can either convert the street space or parking space into natural amenities, or you can also have actual service functions there. What I didn't mention is that some cities where you don't have enough demand to have a shop for the entire day, you can think of mobile units, a mobile health center that comes at a certain time, parks there, maybe in the morning, is in one neighborhood and then moves to the other neighborhood. So that again, you can use parking space for those kind of mobile opportunities.
Thank you so much for sharing insights. Thank you.
Great, colleagues. Unfortunately, I will have to move on, but it was a real pleasure engaging. Thank you very much for having me, and maybe CLC colleagues want to say some final words. So over to my colleagues from CLC.
No, I think just a big thank you to Dr. Philipp, and thank you all for participating in today's session.
Great, my pleasure. Take care. Bye-bye. Thank you.